with the last bit. So after we finish off the mini course, and I'm not going to get this done this week. The holidays on Monday, and I've got kids in the family I have to do stuff with. So, but on next week, I will send out certificates of completion to everybody that's attended the course. So I'll send this to you via your email. And then I will also, when I send out the certificates next week, I will email copies of all of the slide sets that we have posted. And then we've got all of your information tracked. Thanks again for filling out all the registration forms. So we've got your emails, addresses saved. And when we get the website converted back over to the College of Science and it's back up and running, I'll make sure to send all of y'all the link to the website. You could probably find it just from a Google search, but I'll send you the link to the website so you can go on there and take a look at some of the different resources that will be on there. You'll see that the mini course will be on there. We have a YouTube channel for the center. It might or might not be renamed to something under the College of Science, but we already have the channel created. Excuse me. And we will put up the videotape sessions from the mini course. And then we've also got a short course that we ran about a month ago that was not an in-person class. It was just 4 sessions that I taped talking about some more in detailed information for genetics and immunology and that kind of stuff. Some of those topics we've covered in here, some of them we haven't, but that will also be available on the website as well. So once the website gets up and running, it's supposed to be converted over by the 1st of June. I'll reach back out to everybody with the links for that. I'll send over your certificates next week once I can get them signed by the big bosses over here. And then I'll also make sure that I include all the slides as well. And the last thing I just would like to throw out there as well is unless some disaster that I can't foresee happens, I plan on being here for several more years at the very least. So if you, in the next year or so, or 6 months or something like that, you have a question about some of the stuff that we've talked about in the course, you have a question about career opportunities, you have a question about some of the programs or things happening up here at UTRGV, please feel free to reach out to me through my email address and give me a jingle and ask me if I can give you some guidance on stuff. I'll do everything that I can to try to help you out. This is something that I often do. Well, I do all the time actually for former students, for classes that I've taught and that kind of stuff. And so even though this wasn't a formal class, I still kind of consider y'all students of mine. So if you need help moving forward, finding information at UTRGV, or you've got questions about some of the programs, or maybe you're interested in joining one of the research labs up here and you'd like to try to get some more information about it, you're always welcome to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to try to get you an answer and give you some advice as much as I can to try to help you out. So with having said that, I want to spend the last session today kind of talking about resources for genetics. This isn't really going to be just limited to genetics, though. It's actually also going to be for STEM as well, for STEM fields as well. So I wanted to kind of go over what are some of the resources that are available out there. Some of the stuff that y'all may already be aware of, some of it may not be. All of these things that I'm going to show you are things that I was able to track down online, most of them through the NIH's website or one of the sub facilities under NIH. And so as a result, these are all free. So these are all things that you can look at, you can download and interact with for free. Some of them are activities, some of them are games that you can play with students or with yourself to kind of build your knowledge. There's a lot of information on there in terms of slides that you can download, little video courses that you can watch. And so I wanted to share these with y'all, and we'll kind of go through what some of these resources are. We can click on a few of these things to kind of get an eye for what they look like. And then we'll talk a little bit about opportunities that are available here at UTRGV, and maybe not so much maybe in the Valley now, but what I see coming here in the future, as well as opportunities that exist other UT system schools around the state. If you're interested in continuing an education or a career in this field, but maybe you're lacking some of the experience that you need to get started, we'll go over some places where you can maybe get some of that experience. So the first thing I kind of wanted to bring out was just some of these STEM teaching resources that are offered through NIH. And because, again, these are offered through NIH, most of these things are going to be free. I didn't see a single thing that I clicked on and asked me to pay or anything like that. Now, some of the links not these links, but some of the links that you'll find when you go to some of these websites. And we're going to click on some of these here in a moment, take a look at some of them. Some of the links don't work because they're 8 to 10 years old, and the person that was maintaining the link from NIH is not there anymore, and NIH has let it drop. So not every single offering that NIH has is going to be actually up and functional. There were a few of the links that I clicked on their website that went to dead end pages saying, this page no longer exists. But by and large, a lot of these things are available and active. And so it's worth, I think, taking a look at this stuff and kind of seeing what are some of the offerings. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this very first one, that's science and education. So if you'll give me a moment just to open this up, and then let me share my screen here. Okay, so this is the NIH's STEM teaching resources page, where they've got a lot of different stuff on here. It's primarily focused on education materials that are going to be for kids that are K through 12. Again, for any of y'all that are here that are educators, even if you're educating at the college level, for some of these studies and some of these discussions are going to be maybe in topics that students haven't heard before. So it might be worth, even though these are technically set for kids that are in junior high and high school, you may still be able to get some utility out of this for undergraduate students, or even, first year graduate students that are kind of starting to try to understand how things work at the big picture level. And you'll notice right here, there is a little thing that says these are additional links, and they can't attest to the accuracy and accessibility of a non-federal site. So some of the links may work, some of them may not. But if you scroll down and you look, there are a lot of different subtopics that you can choose under here. Let's go look at scientific tools and methods. So we click on this, and you can see some of the different things that are down here as you scroll down. Here is something that's targeting the high school level, that's looking at genetics. How are genes inherited? How does heritability work? You can go and look at some of the resources that are here. If you click on this right here, now some of these that I clicked on took me to this right here where it says the requested page cannot be found. So some of these will pop up and hit you with this little link that doesn't work. But if you scroll down, you can see, and most of these links actually do work, that they've got links on here that you can click on that will take you to something else that will let you look at, hey, what are some of the different things on here? Here's AI, using AI to analyze photographs of the placenta to look at fetal development. As you scroll down here, you can look at some of the things that NIH has that they offer in terms of bioengineering, biomedical imaging, and then you can further click on these links to learn more about the topic. And some of these web pages have got interactable, clickable things that you can look at in terms of bionics, for example. This is a field that's been rapidly expanding as we've developed better technology, both in the computational space as well as in robotics, that we've been able to build better prosthetic limbs, to the point to where many people now that have got prosthetic limbs, for considering that it is a prosthetic limb and it's not your natural limb, can still get a lot of function out of it. There's a guy that I work out with sometime at the gym that had cancer about 10 years ago, and he has a prosthetic limb, and it's one of these double shock cushion limbs like this that you see nowadays, and it functions very, very well. He walks almost without any limp at all. I saw him squatting a couple days ago. He squats a couple 100 pounds. He's about a 150-pound guy, but he's been able to get a lot of mobility back from, he lost his limb, I think, when he was about 14 years old to cancer, and he got fitted with a new bionic about 10 years ago after having used one of the traditional kind of peg leg prosthetics that you see on pirate movies for the first 10 years of his life. He's from Guatemala, and he lives here now. But so there's some different areas where you can look on here to kind of get more information on these things that are related to robotics, for example, or some of the biological engineering programs. If you want to look at cellular and multicellular technology, living materials, these are materials that are being looked at right now that are composed of organic, semi-inert substances. So it's an organic matrix that's been inactivated to not decay or to be very resistant to decay. And then embedded in this organic matrix are small little materials that can be used, for example, to filter water. So if anyone has seen or read the books Dune, and they talk about the Fremen running around in the desert with their little suits that can process their waste and reclaim water and oxygen. This is actually something that they've been working on for the last 10 years using this concept of living materials. And what they're actually looking at it for are primarily for military applications. So the idea is that you would be able to put on a uniform or a combat suit that would contain these materials in the lining of the suit. And then as you're out doing your combat operations and you're generating sweat, the heat and the movement from your body, very similar to, it's kind of how fiction, like makes life, so to speak, very similar to the Dune movies, moving and operating in these suits, the heat and the movement generates energy that's then used to push liquids through these filtration systems, ending up in a little pack right around your stomach. It's got drinkable water that you can then drink from. So there's a lot of really neat stuff that's out there that a lot of us just aren't aware of because they don't really advertise these types of things. And if you don't really know or you're not interested enough to go out there and look, you may not find some of them. So there's a lot of little things here that you can click on that will give you some ideas on what some of these things are. And again, I think moving forward, as you kind of look at where science and technology is going in the 21st century, a lot of focus right now is on wearable technology, right? The big thing are the glasses right now. When I got this new phone a couple days ago, they wanted to sell me a pair of the Ray-Ban interactive VR glasses for like an additional $100. And so they're really starting to push this wearable technology. There's a lot of people running around with wearable PCs that they're trying to miniaturize to the point to where they can be something that would be useful. So there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening. And these are all things, again, that indirectly would speak to possible job opportunities or maybe career opportunities that folks might not be aware of. So I think it's always kind of fun to go sit if you've got a few minutes and go scroll through and look at some of these different things to kind of see what are these different subgroups within NIH really focusing on. Molecular materials is something, and the computational models for biomedical intervention, what this is really looking at is what is the engineering and the technology that needs to be developed to make molecular materials. So molecular materials, and this is something I was asked to test some molecular materials during the COVID pandemic. People have developed fabrics that are resistant to viruses and bacteria. These fabrics are designed and with special fibers that are coated with substances that give the fabric a positive charge. And this positive charge works to degrade viruses and bacteria when they land on the clothing. And so right now they're looking at designing this, using these fabrics to design gowns for working in the hospital. But you could also see them maybe having an application to this to make certain types of clothes. Maybe if you work in the medical industry, your scrubs, you could buy a pair of scrubs that's made out of this stuff. So you have a better chance of protecting not only yourself, but other patients as you travel from room to room. If you're a critical care nurse, for example, taking care of 4 or 5 patients in the critical care ICU, you'll need to be able to go from room to room. Right now, this involves having to put on disposable lab coats and then wash your hands, take everything off when you leave the room, put on new stuff, move to the next room, primarily to help to limit the chances for contamination from patient to patient. But if you've got a wearable piece of clothing that you can just wear as a normal piece of clothing that's comfortable, that can also help you protect yourself from pathogen exposure as well as protect other people you may be caring for, this would be something that would be very beneficial. So there's a lot of these little things that are on here on NIH that it's really worth people going to take the time to take a look at. I mean, at the end of the day, we're paying for all this shit, right? Our tax dollars are paying for this stuff. And so it's worth, I think, kind of maybe taking a look and seeing what are some of these things that are out here that I'm paying for that I don't know about that might be something that would be interesting to think about, or maybe to expose other people to, such as students. So there's a lot of these little clickable links on here. And as you go down, they've got it broken down in terms of sound. If you've got something you're going to talk about through sound, and they kind of give you down here what the target audience is, and they tell you where this is coming from. And then again, you can click on the buttons down here to learn more. Here is a virtual lab that lets you learn about DNA extraction. This lets you actually do a virtual lab experiment where you will perform a cheek swab and extract DNA from the cheek swab. So it will kind of walk you through this right here. So you can sit to look at this, and then you can click on some of these extra links and kind of, this even gives you a way to set up the experiment if you wanted to set this up for maybe students in your class or something like that. It gives you some protocols that you can use to kind of set up some of these things. So there's a lot of good information that's on here. Here's something about regenerative medicine, mental health and the brain. There's a lot of different things on here. Mobile lab experiences, more stuff about the brain that's now at middle and high school, some stuff about basic science careers, basics about imaging. So I think it's really worth going to take a look at this. And again, this is coming from the link from the NIH's webpage that I'll go ahead and share back with everybody again. So this is from this first link up here. So I've included several of these up here for y'all to go ahead and take a look at. I think another one that's really good is this one with NCBI. NCBI is the National Cancer and Biotechnology Information website. And this is a more formal resource that may not be super appropriate for students or people that are just learning about stuff. This is a resource that's maybe more geared towards junior scientists, people that are doing research, or people that are interested in getting into research, or maybe learning more about proteins and genomes and that kind of stuff. So on the NCBI website, as you can see over here in the left-hand side, they've got a lot of resources about DNA, RNA, for example. They will bring up databases that you can look at. They've got bio collections of all kinds of DNA that's been sequenced from different types of plants and animals. They've got a collection of genomes down here in the bio project and a link to the data sets. There's a lot of really neat information that's on here. GenBank is probably the most famous of all the resources that the NIH maintains, and this is the NIH's genetic sequence base. And so this database, anytime you publish a paper involving a genomic sequence, a genetic sequence, even if it's for a virus that you made. I made a lot of viral clones when I was a graduate student for vaccines. Every time we published a new paper, you required, if you got the money from the NIH to do the work, which 99% of us do, they require you to publish the DNA sequences for anything that you've worked with and published in your paper so they can annotate it in this huge database. And so they have a massive database within the GenBank, and you can see up here exactly what it covers. It not only tells you how to submit everything, but it lets you look at all the different genomes. So they've got genomes for prokaryotes. These are going to be the bacteria. Eukaryotes, this is everything else. They've got whole genome sequences, metagenomes. There's a massive amount of information that's contained in this website, and they actually tell you how to access this stuff, how to, if you have a new sequence that you want to look at and try to figure out what it is, you can use this tool called BLAST, for example. So BLAST is a tool that stands for, it's a alignment search tool, but what is really neat about BLAST is that you can take a DNA sequence that you have and you can put it into BLAST. You basically just copy and paste it. And then once you have your DNA sequence that you put in here and you click on BLAST, BLAST will then take that sequence, particularly if it's an unknown sequence, and it will match it up against known sequences and say, hey, this DNA sequence that you've put in here is 99% similar to this gene that comes from this virus, or this gene that comes from this bacteria, or this human gene that's used to encode for hemoglobin. And they'll not only show you everything that would relate to humans, but they'll show you animals as well. And they'll give you a score from most similar to least similar. And then you can click on links that come with those scores and learn more about the gene that BLAST is suggesting that your unknown sequence most closely resembles. And so BLAST is probably a tool that is most commonly used by anybody doing this kind of work for a living because the database is massive. I think they've got over 14 million unique DNA sequences in here. I mean, we've sequenced dogs, multiple species of dogs and cats. I mean, just about everything that we've come into contact with biologically in probably the last 25 years, plants, insects, funguses, they've all been sequenced and that information has been put in here. So when I started to use BLAST 30 years ago, it was a bit hit and miss because the database wasn't that huge, and you'd put in an unknown sequence and get back blast guess of what it is, and the first 20 things would be the same damn thing because there wasn't a lot of database to blast against to check. Nowadays, when you put a sequence in and you blast it, not only do you get a wide range, but the data is much more, the integrity is much higher. The results are much more accurate because the database has grown. And this is one of these things that as the database for BLAST grows, the answers and the responses and the accuracy of those responses get much better. So this would be something that if you were going to maybe set up an activity for students to do, and I've done this in the past, I give the students a DNA sequence and then say, hey, take it into BLAST and blast it and tell me what you get. And then write down what you got, what does it look like? What is it most closely resembling? And you can also do the same thing for protein. So this is for nucleotides right up here. So this is going to be for genomes, but you can do the same thing for proteins as well. So you can take a protein sequence and blast. When you blast in a DNA sequence, it will automatically give you the protein sequence as well for that gene. So you can then take that protein sequence and blast it again against a protein database and then see how many proteins match up. And then you can follow links to see what does that protein look like in three-dimensional space. When I did this 30 years ago, I had to buy a separate modeling program and then manually put in the residue, serine, threonine. Oh, what was that? Oh, shit, I missed one. It was a huge pain in the ass putting in 200 or 300 residues and making sure you didn't miss one. Now you can take this information, blast your DNA sequence, get the protein sequence, copy and paste that and blast that, and be taken to a free program that models what the protein looks like in three-dimensional space. So then you can kind of look at it and say, okay, this protein that we think that we're making should look like this, and it should have this active site, and it should be folded in this way. Is that happening, yes or no? And then if it's not happening, you can mess with it to try to figure out why is it not working out the way that you predicted it would. And again, these are all resources that are free. In addition to being able to use the free resources for checking nucleotide sequences and protein sequences, the NCBI also maintains a free collection of materials, biological materials that you can request access to. So if maybe you're a graduate student doing a thesis or you're working in a lab somewhere and you're like, man, I would really like to get a hold of this cell type. There is a cell type that's been made, for example, that's a cancer cell that works really, really well in certain types of assays, for example. And so you can reach out to NCBI and say, hey, I'd like to get some of those cells. And they'll charge you, I think, $3 to $5 to pay for shipping. But other than that, they'll send you the cells for free. So they also exist as a biorepository to be able to look at different substances that they might have. Not only cells, they have a lot of experimental drugs. And so people have designed drugs thinking that's going to be able to be useful in treating this kind of disease, but it didn't really work. So rather than throw the drug away, they send it to NCBI, and NCBI saves it because in 20 or 30 years, maybe it will be useful for something else. And this is what we've seen happen a lot in the last 5 or 10 years, is that shit that was made 30 years ago that we thought wasn't going to be useful ends up finding a use in something completely different than what it was intended. We saw this during the COVID pandemic with things like ivermectin, right? The famous quote unquote horse warmer that Joe Rogan took. It's not really a horse warmer, but it's what the media called it. But these things were made like 30 years ago. They didn't work very well. They submitted the samples to NCBI. And then when the pandemic happened, people started looking around saying, what can be used to treat this infection? And when they started to query the database with the sequence from the COVID virus, the SARS virus, to say, hey, is there any drug in the database that might be effective against this? Ivermectin was one of the results that came back. And so people requested ivermectin for free from NCBI. They did some work in the lab in test tubes with COVID virus to see whether or not it was effective. And then it was effective, and they went from there. So they maintain a large biorepository as well. And for 99% of things that you're going to ask for, they're going to give them to you for free. Now, you can't request stuff if you're doing science in your garage. They're not going to send you things to play with at your house. But if you're working in a lab somewhere and they can send it to an academic institution, they'll send it to you for free 99% of the time, or for a very small shipping fee. So there's a large repository of information that's out there that doesn't just rely solely on resources, that also relies on biologicals if you'd like to get a hold of some of those as well. So what are some other resources that we can take a look at? Let me make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay. So, and I won't bother you with beating you to death with this other link, but this is something that looks at clinical trials. Let me just click on it real quick, so I can say that we looked at it a little bit. So this is for clinical trials. Clinical trials are something that we are really trying to lean into as an institution down here in down here at UTRGV. So we actually have a clinical trial research division that's right now headquartered in the School of Medicine. It's ran out of the buildings that we have in Harlingen. And essentially what a clinical trial is, and I'm sure a lot of y'all already are aware of this, but basically when you develop a drug that you're intending to push to market, that's going to target a specific disease. And if you remember when we had the presentation yesterday about how testing is regulated in terms of, does this test work? Does it identify what you want to identify? How does it work in the presence of mutants? And does the information that it gives us is it even meaningful? We take a similar approach when we develop a new drug for clinical trials. And so the difference between clinical trials and running experiments in your lab is that there's a high degree of regulation and oversight that comes along with the clinical trial, because these are ideally going to be substances that we're going to move into human beings. And so if you're going to take a new drug for the first time, most of us would probably prefer that that drug be pretty well tested, particularly for safety and tolerance. No one wants to take something that's going to give them hot dog finger or make them grow a third eye. So you want to make sure that these things go through a very rigorous process of testing. And this is why we have clinical trials. Clinical trials operate in phases. Well, we're calling them phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. You probably hear this a lot on the TV. They say, okay, this drug's in phase 2 clinical trials, or it's moving to phase 3. And the differences between the different phases is that primarily in the early stages of clinical trials, stage 1 clinical trials, those are primarily testing for safety and general utility. If you made a new drug to target certain types of ovarian cancer, does it clear out those cancer cells? Can it target those cancer cells? And what are the side effects? So a stage 1 clinical trial is usually going to be very focused on side effects, not so much focused on utility. If it makes through stage 1, then stage 2 tends to start to focus more on utility and less on side effects. It's about a 50-50 split. And when you get to stage 3, at that point, most of the safety parameters have kind of been addressed, and you're really then focusing on how effective is this drug going to be. So this is a level of research that has to be done under clinical care parameters. You've usually got to have a nurse on hand. You've got to have a physician that's going to be the medical officer responsible for taking care of the healthcare concerns in the clinical trial. If we're running a clinical trial, we ran a clinical trial last year using stem cells to treat Alzheimer's disease and alcoholism in Harlingen. And so one of the things you've got to look at when you run these kind of clinical trials is, how well are people going to tolerate these drugs? And if they have an adverse response, what's the response going to be? And we've got to make sure we've got somebody here to take care of it. So it's very different than doing research in the lab where, 99% of the time, a mouse is not going to complain and say, man, that shot you gave me really hurts. A person will. And so these are the things that you kind of need to make sure that you address in a clinical trial setting. And so because clinical trials require a lot of oversight, it's not something a lot of institutions run. But having said that, it's a very profitable business to get into if you've got a structure in place. And so UTRGV has been really leaning into trying to get a clinical trial division up and running. We've done some small stage clinical trials, and I suspect moving forward, because of the unique resource that we have in the Valley, which is a Hispanic majority population, this is something that you'll see a lot of clinical trials probably try to come and set up here, because they want to be able to test their drugs in that population. I did a clinical trial during the COVID pandemic for second generation COVID vaccines. So they made the first COVID vaccines, quote unquote, and they wanted to make a second series of COVID vaccines. They couldn't get the approval fast enough to do the clinical trials here. So they ran the clinical trials in Brazil, and then they would collect blood and tissues from the patients in Brazil and then send them to me because I was physically the closest lab that they had to Brazil. And then we would process and mess with those samples and do some testing on them. And then we would send the final samples back to the company, which was headquartered in London, England. And so this is another route that many companies will take when they need to do clinical trial work. Sometimes because of the regulatory burden, it's really tough to get these things going in America, but it's easier to get them set up in other places. And so they'll run the clinical trial outside of the United States, but then they may use labs, partner labs in the United States to process and test those clinical samples, and then they will send the data back to the home company, if you will, depending on where they're located at. So clinical trials is something I see expanding a lot down here in the Valley in the immediate future. And so it's something that I think you can kind of consider it that may be a career that you might see really start to open up here in the next few years. Because again, there's a really unique resource down here in the Valley with the population that's not really been utilized because we haven't had the structure in place to be able to run clinical trials down here. So I think clinical trials is something else that we'll see a lot of growth down here. And it's worth, I think, taking a look at as you maybe look at not only job opportunities perhaps for yourself, but if you're talking to students as well, what are some of the different opportunities that they may be able to find? And then there's some additional free resources you can look at through the Google. If you just Google NIH teaching resources or genetics teaching resources, you'll get some of these links, but you'll get some other ones as well. And again, all of these are going to be free resources. So in addition to having these resources that are available at the federal level, we have resources that are also available here at UTRGV that we host within the UTRGV system. And so again, we've got some different links up here that I would recommend that y'all take some time to go click on. These are going to bring up, again, pages that will link to activities that can be done with students, with online games that you can play to either build your knowledge or build the knowledge of students. And these are things that are all hosted here at UTRGV. And so as long as the university is up and running, these links should all remain active. I checked on all these links this morning before I came down for the shipment talk. And all these links are up and functional and active. So there's some additional resources that you can look at for UTRGV that, again, are primarily going to be geared towards education, and they're going to focus on that K through 12 target audience, if you will. But there's some good stuff that's on there. And again, particularly if you're looking at this from an instructional perspective, if you're a teacher that's teaching either maybe undergraduates or juniors or seniors in high school, and people are starting to ask the question, what am I going to do when I leave this mad place? These are some things that might help you give them some guidance. What are some different opportunities that are here that exist within UTRGV? Now, this list is not a all-encompassing list. I really wanted to focus on the educational programs that are primarily related to science. Now, I left out medicine. The medicine is a separate path. And so I think probably a lot of people are aware that we have a school of medicine, we have a medical school. You want to be a physician, you've got to apply to go to the medical school and go that route. And for medicine, it doesn't really matter as much as it used to in terms of what your degree is. I've sat on the admissions committee for the School of Medicine for, I think, the last 10 years, and we will admit students that don't have science degrees in biology or chemistry. If they've got, good GPAs and they get good scores on the MCAT is the medical college admissions test. This is the entry-level test. I'm sure you're all aware of what it is to get into medical school. It covers a lot of science and research and knowledge about science and genetics and immunology and such, microbiology. And so if you're able to get through the MCAT and you're coming with a BA in art, which I've seen some of these people come in and successfully get into medical school, the degree doesn't really so much matter anymore for medicine. For PhD programs, the story is going to be a little bit different. And the 3 PhD programs I kind of want to talk a little bit about are the PhD program in genetics that's housed within the Department of Human Genetics. And then we have a material science and engineering program that's within the College of Science. And then we have the computer science PhD, which is of course housed within the College of Computer Science. So for these degree programs, the minimum degree that's required is usually going to be a BS. Some of these degree programs will take you with a Bachelor of Arts, but you have to keep in mind many of these programs, admission is going to be competitive. There's going to be 5 slots and 50 applicants. And so obviously the goal of the people that are running the program is to try to pull who they think are the best students into those positions. And the evaluation of someone's suitability for a program often starts with what you submit on paper, because for many of us, until we get the chance to go sit for an interview, the only way we exist for people that are on these admissions committees is going to be on paper. And so we look at what your CV and your resume and your transcripts look like to try to gauge how well you would be suited for the program compared to the other people that are applying for the program at the same time. And so this isn't to say that you've got to always push to get the highest degree with the most honors and that kind of stuff. But where I think you could make a great jump for yourself is if you're going to get into a PhD program, that you look at the PhD program and see what kind of stuff do they require, and see if what you're doing is going to be a fit for it. And if you don't on paper think it's a good fit, then you need to come up with logic behind why you would make a good fit for this. And again, I use the example of medical school admissions. When I interview students for admission into medical school, I get somebody coming in with a BA in art history. So I'm going to ask them, what's your strength of coursework? What classes have you taken that you think prepares you for medicine? What other things have you done to prepare yourself for a career in medicine? And you'll see that maybe this person that's got this BA in art history spent 4 or 5 years volunteering in a cancer research lab, and they spent 4 or 5 years volunteering at a local clinic. They've done some other things to kind of help support their application, because they know that maybe their education just on its face is not going to be enough to maybe win people over. So I think an easy way to kind of avoid that issue is to make sure that when you're going to apply for a PhD program, that you're looking at what the qualifications are and whether or not you think you've got the right qualifications for it. Does this mean that if you got a bachelor's degree in business that you shouldn't apply for the PhD program in computer science? No. But if you're going to get a PhD in computer science, you're basically getting a master's degree in mathematics. If you've taken an undergraduate degree that doesn't have any math past reading, writing, and subtraction or some crap, you're going to be in trouble. You may need additional coursework to get caught up on that. So it's always worth checking to see what the minimum requirements are. But so let's use the genetics PhD program, for example, amongst these three, because that's the one that I'm the most familiar with. So we generally look at people coming in with a Bachelor of Science in some kind of a field. It could be biology, it could be chemistry, it could be biochemistry. It's generally going to be a life science. We also do look at people that come in with bachelor's degrees in computer science, because a lot of genetics nowadays is bioinformatics. It's crunching big data sets. And probably 30 or 40% of the people that work in the Department of Human Genetics, they are geneticists, but their training began in computer science, because we need people that are very skilled in using computers and programming and understanding how to manipulate and work with large sets of data to be able to be successful in genetics. And so sometimes in a PhD program, you may not have a bachelor's degree in genetics, but that may not be needed if you've got a degree in computer science or something that's relatable. So this kind of feeds back into the idea of making sure that you're checking what the admission requirements are before you apply for something. But for the genetics PhD program, we're generally looking here for people that are coming in with a bachelor, a BS at a minimum. If you come in with a master's, that's probably a little bit better. The way that it kind of goes, and this is a generalization, is a PhD program usually is going to take you about 5 to 7 years if you're starting with a bachelor's degree. If you're starting with a master's degree, it will take you about maybe 4 to 5 years. So there's kind of a trade-off that's there. When I did my PhDs at Galveston, I got a master's degree first, but I did that primarily because with my bachelor's degree, I didn't have a lot of research experience, and I needed research experience, which is something else we'll talk about here in just a minute, to be able to really be successful at the PhD level. And so I got a master's degree so I could do 2 years of research in a virology lab that I managed to get into my senior year when I was an undergrad. And so I used that master's degree to lift up my experience. And so when I got to Galveston, I already knew how to do shit. I already knew how to run gels and extract DNA and culture cells and mess with viruses and do some basic stuff. So I didn't have to spend 2 years as a doctoral candidate learning those skills. I already learned them when I was working on my graduate degree. So, but there were some people that showed up at UTMB that didn't have master's degrees, and they ended up completing the program. It did take them 7 to 8 years. So it's kind of something to kind of keep in mind that while there may be a minimum degree required to get into a PhD program, the more education that you can bring to it is probably going to shorten the time that you're going to spend in that program. Certainly, it will help shorten the time that you spend doing the coursework for the program. If you get a master's degree at a UT system school, for example, I got a master's degree at UTSA. When I went to Galveston, I was able to transfer 95% of those classes to Galveston. And so the first 18 months of the PhD program in Galveston, I didn't have to go to class because I already taken all those 36 hours as a graduate student at San Antonio. And I think they gave me credit for 32 of the 36 hours. So I didn't even have to go to class for the first year. So what that let me do that first year was focus on the research, focus on finding a lab, getting in a lab and getting my research going, which is something that takes you about a year to get going. And if you're also taking 9 to 12 hours of classes at the same time, it can be really, really tough to get that going. And this is what tends to slow a lot of people down when they're doing that PhD. So making sure that you can at least meet or exceed the requirements for admission is going to be very helpful. And then also making sure that at the institution you're going to do your PhD at, that you want to do your PhD at, that you're taking a look to see the people that are in that department that host the PhD, what kind of crap are they doing? Is anyone doing anything there that you feel is interesting, that you feel might be something you might want to learn more about? If you want to do AI modeling and make, robots, and we don't make, and the computer science program here, PhD program at UTRGV doesn't focus on that, then this probably isn't the place for you to go. Or you maybe need to retool what it is that you're looking to do. And I think a lot of this stuff kind of feeds back into when you're going to make this kind of investment of not only money, but your time, which is by far the most valuable resource that we have. You can always get more money, but you can't get back the time that you spent yesterday. So you want to make sure that wherever you're going to go, you're going to be able to take this education and turn it into something, turn it into a career. And so it's always, I think, very useful when you're looking at a PhD program, if you're going to invest the time to get a PhD, that you're also looking to see what kind of money can I make with this thing. When I did my degrees and I started to look at how much money I was going to have to spend, I am a poor kid from the backwoods in Texas. My family did not have a shitload of money. So I had to borrow everything that I used to go to school. When I had to borrow 150 grand to go to pay for all my education, I sat down and said, okay, if everything works out perfectly and I get these degrees and I have all these titles and stuff, what kind of job can I make? And then how much money can I earn? And how long will it take me to earn that money to make spending 150 grand to get this education worthwhile? I think this is something that a lot of people don't do nowadays. And I've even seen my own kids do this where they are spending X amount of dollars on getting a degree, and then they're looking at getting a job that's going to pay them half the salary of what they spent for their degree. And it's like, how long are you going to have to work to pay off that loan to make it worthwhile? So for me, for example, I looked and said, okay, it's going to cost me $150,000 to get my degree. But if I do everything well and I end up getting the kind of position that I want, I should be able to make $150,000 to $200,000 a year at that position. And if I can work that job for 20 years, then that's $2 million. If it's 30 years, it's going to be $4 million or something. So it's worth taking the time when you sit down before you get too far down the educational road and you spend a lot of your money and time to kind of see what you think the output's going to be and the result at the end of the day. And is it really worth going through all these things? I think one of the great things about here at UTRGV that would have been awesome when I was doing this shit 30 years ago is that if you don't make a certain level of money, that the schooling is free. So I think the cutoff is $100,000. If your parents made less than $100,000, your tuition at UTRGV is free. So there are some programs here within the university that they've put into place to kind of help control the tuition costs. Now, I don't know how useful those things are. I haven't looked into them that much because they obviously don't apply to me. I know that I looked at them a little bit when my kids started school here, and I make too much money to get free tuition, but that's okay because I never planned on getting them free tuition. But it's worth spending this time to do this. I find sometimes when I have kids in my lab that work for me come and talk about jobs and that kind of stuff, I'm sometimes surprised to see how many of them haven't given this much thought to what you're doing. If you're going to spend a shitload of money to get a degree, you got to get something for that for your money. If you're going to spend $100,000 to get a degree that's only going to get you a job making $30,000 a year, that's a bad idea. That's a really bad idea. And so I think a lot of times though, people get caught up in getting the degree and wanting, because it's a big accomplishment and wanting to get that college degree and that kind of stuff, but don't oftentimes think about what are you going to use it for at the end of the day. And so I think it's worth giving this some consideration. But if you look at the genetics PhD program here, we usually run a class of about 9 to 12 students a year. We've only been running it for about 3 years now. We're getting ready to graduate our first class, our first cohort next year. And we're taking about half the students we take from the Valley, and the other half we're taking from overseas. A lot of the reason for that is that we are not getting a lot of applicants from the Valley, surprisingly. We get a ton of applicants from overseas, but we don't get that many applicants from the Valley. And what I've seen in the last couple cycles is that if we get applicants from the Valley and they're decent applicants, they're going to get a slot in the program because we would kind of rather pick people from the Valley than pick people from overseas. It's not because the people from overseas are bad or anything, but I mean, part of our goal and mission here is to lift up the community that we are involved in. And if we can get qualified candidates from the Valley, then we would prefer to take those qualified candidates that are locally from here, as opposed to taking somebody coming from India or from England or from Pakistan or some other place. Not that those are bad candidates, and we have many of those candidates here, but we would prefer to take local people if they're available. So I think there's just some things to kind of consider when you're looking at this kind of stuff. There are also some research programs within the School of Medicine that are focused on cancer research. In McAllen, there is a building that's off of Dove by Jackson called the MBRM. It's the McAllen Biomedical Research Building. And that's where the Department of Genetics has offices in McAllen. And we also share that building with the Cancer Center at the School of Medicine. Cancer research is one of those fields of research that's probably not going to go away anytime soon. It's been rapidly expanding over the last 30 years. I remember when I was doing one of my postdocs in Dallas, the lab that I did my postdoc in, that I did a lot of hemorrhagic fever virus research, was a cancer research lab. But the guy had gotten a big grant because he discovered that a drug that he made to treat colon cancer was very effective at killing viruses. And so he got a lot of grant money to study this, but he didn't know how to do the virus work. So he brought me in from the CDC for 2 years to do this work for him. While I was working in his lab, I started to finish up the project. I started applying for jobs, and my boss was like, "Hey, have you thought about just switching over to cancer?" And I was like, "Nah, I don't want to do cancer, man. I like viruses. I've been doing this virus shit for 20 years already. I'm going to stick with viruses." He's like, "Look, there's a lot of money in cancer. There's a lot of research money. There's a lot of money in cancer." And I've seen now over the last 20 years that he's right, because the money for infectious disease rises and falls. 3 years ago, you couldn't fill your pockets with all the money because all the money coming out for the COVID pandemic. The moment the COOF went away, the funding crashed. Cancer research funds stay very high, and they have stayed high for 20 or 30 years because cancer is something that affects everybody. There's probably not a person sitting in this meeting right now that hasn't had a close relative have something to do with cancer. I have my brother's daughters right now is fighting leukemia. My mother-in-law died of stage 4 lung cancer, never smoked a day in her life. She lived right over here off of Jackson in Brownsville and came down with stage 4 lung cancer and died in about 4 years. So this is something that affects a lot of people. And so there's been a lot of resources devoted to understanding cancer. And this is going to be something that will probably remain very lucrative for research and for careers for many, many years to come. It's going to be very tough. We talk about AI and robots taking people's jobs, and that's going to probably happen if you're looking to make burgers at Whataburger, because it's cheaper to teach a robot to flip the patty than it is to pay you $40 an hour to work at Whataburger. But there's some of these fields that you're not going to be able to outsource to a damn robot or a computer. And doing biomedical research is going to be one of those things. You can maybe program a robot to go into a lab and pick up a tube and move it over here and squirt some liquid in there, but you can't train the robot to be able to look at that and make a call as to whether or not the sample is good, to look in the microscope and decide how the cells look in there, how's the virus replicating, how is this drug responding against these infections if you're looking at drug discovery or vaccine design. So these fields are going to remain very lucrative. And I think cancer research is another thing that's worth exploring as a career opportunity. And again, a lot of cancer research and cancer diagnostics uses genetics. Right before we came in here, I was a few minutes late because we are one of our plans with all of the genomic sequencing that we do is to do commercial cancer diagnostics, because there's a lot of money in there and there are not a lot of labs in the country right now that can do cancer diagnostics. And so there's a lot of interplay and cross communication, if you will, between fields like cancer and genetics, as well as genetics, computer science, and cancer, that would all be very lucrative careers if you can get into those fields. And there's also a level of, and I say that they're entry level tech jobs, but there's also technical positions that are available in many of these labs that are doing this work. If you would prefer to maybe you're more comfortable being a worker bee than you are being responsible for the entire lab. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I've had a lot of great people that have worked for me that really helped me succeed, that were the quote unquote worker bees. And many of those worker bees, after 3 to 4 years of working for me, leave and they go to medical school, they go get a PhD, they go get a job at a company, and they're making a bank right now. They're making a huge bag of money. They're very happy with what they're doing. And they started off as an entry-level technician. We have a lot of these entry-level technician jobs available at UTRGV. We have some available here, but there's a lot of them that are available and within the cancer center. And I suspect as we continue to bring on things like the clinical trial program in Harlingen, there's going to be more of these positions available where we're looking for people that have got bachelor's to master's degrees of levels of education. And there are classes that you can take online that will get you certification in things like clinical trial research. Someone with a bachelor's degree that's certified to do clinical trial research, to work in clinical trials, can make 80 grand a year. That's pretty fucking good with a bachelor's degree, man. 80 grand a year, that's pretty good. I had to get a doctorate degree to be able to start to make that kind of money. But those kinds of positions are available. And so again, these are things we're really trying to push down here in the Valley. So don't think that you've got to get a terminal degree, that it's got to be a PhD or an MD, or that your career is going to be meaningless. There are a lot of very fulfilling, well-paying jobs that are there that are available at that mid-level position. And once you get that experience, particularly if you get that experience in an academic setting, it's very easy to then take that experience to private industry.
Can you do cancer research in the genetics PhD program?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit now about some external opportunities. And right now, unfortunately, a lot of these external opportunities are not going to be located inside of the RGV, and that's kind of a bummer. I think this is something that in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see dramatic expansion of these positions down here in the Valley. Something that I've heard a lot of when I go to scientific conferences is that, and this is one of the benefits, whether you love him or hate him, for Elon Musk bringing SpaceX here. When a company like that comes to an area, particularly an area like Brownsville, that is not on the map in terms of science and research, and that company comes here and then they have the success that they've had, it forces other companies to look and say, huh, what's happening down there? And I think I've mentioned this a couple of times from the talk, but the guy that runs this, that is the manager for SpaceX over here, is from this area. I've met half a dozen people that are out there that work at SpaceX that are from here. Most companies, when they move to an area, they want to hire local people, particularly in an area like this, because the Valley's not an easy place to live. It's hot, it's dry, it's can be dusty and dirty at times. If you're not someone who's down with the Hispanic culture, you're going to really suffer down here. So, or you can suffer. So it takes a unique person, I think, to be able to live down here and really and be successful. I don't think it means you're a crazy person if you want to do something like that, but the valley's not places can be tough to live. I lived in Iowa for 3 years and I hated it because I didn't like freezing my ass off for fucking 5 months out of the year. It sucked. I didn't like it. My wife loved it. She loved seeing the leaves change colors and all that crap. And she liked the snow and all that stuff. She'd have to go out there and shovel it and shit and snow blow it. So that was part of her love affair with the snow. But different people are going to enjoy different environments. And so, but when a company like SpaceX comes down, it forces other companies to start to look and say, well, what's happening down there? And again, this has been part of the impetus for us getting this grant and establishing this center because we already know that the Valley has a huge resource in the amount of strong-willed, smart, dedicated people down here that just need a little bit of guidance and education to really reach their full potential from a career perspective. And so I think as we continue to see UTRGV expanding, and it's kind of weird to think about, but we've only really been a university for about 10 years, right? There was UTPA and UT Brownsville before then, but UTRGV wasn't formally created until 2014. So we've only been around for about 11 years. You look at a place like Galveston or Austin that have been around 100 years, 150 years, and obviously they have a very, very well developed pool of a resource pool for employment because they've been there for a very long time, and over time people have moved there. How many people do you think have moved to Austin for a job? I mean, a shitload of people, right? I mean, I'm from that area and half the people living there ain't even from Texas. They're from Ohio or some crap, but they moved there for a job. They moved there to get a job at Oracle. They moved there to get a job making video games. They moved there to get a job at maybe a biotech company that's there now because Dell Medical School has moved in there. Abbott Biologicals, big scientific company, has moved there. So as we see UTRGV continue to expand the educational offerings, we should start to see more companies move here, and you'll start to see more of these mid-level technical positions being established. I had a company that approached me 2 years ago during the COVID pandemic with some big capital investors wanting to come down here and establish a huge clinical diagnostic lab. So there are companies that are starting to look down here in the Valley, particularly because this is one of the cheapest areas to set up a business right now because we don't have a lot of stuff. And it is in the best interest of the politicians running Hidalgo and Cameron and Willacy to bring these companies down here because they're going to pay more tax money. They're going to offer better jobs. People will get those jobs. They pay more tax money. So it behooves these political groups to bring in these companies and to make it more easy for them to set up. That's one of the reasons Elon Musk came down here. They gave him a bunch of tax breaks. He set up SpaceX, but in return, he gave Brownsville like $30 million 5 years ago to use for buffing up their school programs and that kind of stuff. So I think we're going to continue to see this ball roll as we see things advance and get better down here in the Valley. One thing that I will say is that most of the experience that you need to get to be able to do this kind of work, you're going to have to get it in some kind of a research lab environment. You cannot take a class to learn how to extract DNA. You can take a class that maybe introduces it for a day. Maybe you go to the NIH website and you can see how it's done. But in order for you to get that experience to be able to do it, you've got to end up in a research environment that does this kind of work. This is, again, I already mentioned this a couple days ago, why my lab was recruited to do all the COVID testing, because we've been doing RT-PCR for 5 years before the pandemic ever happened. When that happened and they said, okay, we want you to do this, I said, okay, well, I need you to hire all these people that work in my lab full time. And they didn't want to initially. And I said, well, you're going to have to, because there ain't nobody else down here in the Valley that knows how to do this shit. I can't go to the biology department and say, hey, how many people passed that DNA class? Let me recruit some of them to work. That doesn't exist. You've got to have people that know how to do this stuff. And the only way you're going to learn how to do this stuff is by getting into a research lab. And so I think even if you don't intend on pursuing a degree past a bachelor's degree, it's always worth, and we always have those electives that you have to fill in your last year or two of your bachelor's degree. If you think you might want to have some interest in science, to look at the faculty in the department, in the university, and what some of their research experiences are, what they're doing in their labs, and reach out to them and ask and say, hey, do you have space to take on an undergraduate for a few months? I know that when I recruit students to my lab, that's where I start with, is I say, okay, you want to work with viruses? Okay, come in here for 3 months, enroll in this class. I think it's called directed research or something like that. There's a research class that you can take as an undergrad as an elective that's worth 1 to 3 credit hours. Come in here for a semester. We'll teach you how to do some stuff, and you work here for a couple months and just see whether or not you like it. And if you do at the end, then we'll talk further along about it, kind of like a probationary period to give people a chance to see whether or not they like this kind of stuff. Many research labs, many research labs do this. So if you see something that you're interested in, it's always worth reaching out to the PI, the primary investigator that runs that lab, and say, hey, what do you think about coming in? The worst that they're going to say is no. That's the worst that's going to happen. They're not going to take away your birthday and kick you out of the university. The worst that they're going to say is no. And I know from my experience, 95% of the time, if I had the space in the lab, I said yes. Even if that person had shitty grades, I still said yes, because I was a person that had shitty grades when I was an undergraduate. And I got a chance to get into a research lab for 1 semester, and it changed my life because I got in that lab. It was a virology research lab. I had taken a class in virology and I didn't have any of the prerequisites. I had not taken genetics or cell biology or anything. I had only been out of the Marines, I think, for like 2 years. And it was like the first class I took going back to school. I hadn't been in school since I graduated high school in 1987. And this was in like 94, 95. And I started going to UT Austin. And I took this class and I barely got a C. I was like, what is this DNA crap? I had no idea what this stuff was. And I barely passed the class, but I ran into that professor like 2 months later at the gym, working at the gym in Austin on the UT campus. And we started talking. And he said, hey, you should come into my lab for a semester and do a project. And I was like, dude, I feel bad. I barely got a C in your class. I don't even know what genetics is. And he's like, okay, you didn't take the prerequisites. That's okay. I'll help you out, but come and check it out. And I ended up staying in that guy's lab for 2 years. And then he moved to UTSA to start a new faculty career job there. I moved with him to UTSA, got a master's degree in his lab. I talked to this guy last week. I still talk to him, once or twice a year or so. We're good friends. I see him when I go to San Antonio. But all that started because he gave me the chance to work in his lab for a semester, and my grades went from being low C's to straight A's, and I ended up being able to get into a PhD program and go from there. So if you think that you don't have the qualifications, I wouldn't let that stand in your way. It's always worth reaching out and contacting a PI if they're doing something you think is interesting, and let them make the decision. They may see something in you that you're not aware of, just like some other people have seen in me and I have seen in other people, and they end up bringing you in. Some of the best students I've had were people that I taught a class in that made a C in the class. But I brought them in for a semester. They showed up every day for work. If they fucked up, they came and admitted a mistake, so I didn't have to worry that they were going to be dishonest. And we had a great relationship. And some of the best people that I've met since I've been down here were students that started off in my lab that are now doctors on their own right and doing their own research and that kind of stuff. So it's always worth reaching out to a lab that you think is doing something cool to see if they got space to let you come in there and learn that skill. And if you end up in a lab that you don't really enjoy, as long as you leave that lab in the right way, you can always pivot to another research lab. And if you're doing things the right way, no one's going to talk bad about you if you decide to leave that lab and go to another place. If anything, they're going to help you. Because again, I've had this happen to me where I've had students come to me and say, yeah, I worked in Dr. Vitek's mosquito lab for a year and I didn't really enjoy the mosquitoes, but I really like the virus part. And I know you're studying mosquito transmitted viruses. Could I try a research rotation in here for a semester? And I say, sure. And I go talk to the guy that they worked with, and he says, yeah, they were a good person. They just wasn't for them. So making sure that you get this experience, and if it's not what you want, that you leave it in the right way is always going to be a benefit, but you're never going to know if you don't ask. And so I think it's really worth, if you identify a career field that you're interested in, and you see a research offering here at UTRGV or at any university, that you reach out to that PI and see if you can get a spot in their lab. It's always worth asking. So let's talk a little bit about jobs that are in Texas. So let's say you've got a STEM degree or you've got some experience in STEM. You've been working in a lab for a few years and you've learned how to culture cells, how to work sterilely, you know, how to do some basic assays, and you want to get out for a couple years and get some experience, maybe make some money. You're tired of eating, you know, beanie weenies and spicy noodles, and you want to get a regular job and maybe upgrade your dining to McDonald's or some shit or Spam. So you're going to look around the state. As you could probably imagine, a lot of these companies are going to be located in the larger cities. And so I've just kind of given a small example up here. But Dallas, for example, has UT Southwestern. The UT system is up in Dallas. It's a huge employer. I did my one of my research fellowships at UT Southwestern that's in downtown Dallas. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening in Dallas, not just at UT Southwestern. They always have job positions that are open. I've had several students from my lab leave and go to UT Southwestern to work as technicians and that kind of stuff, and they eventually end up getting a master's or a PhD or something there if they enjoy the area. But there are a lot of lab associated businesses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to support the research happening at UT Southwestern. Bausch and Lomb, for example, the people that make contacts, they have a huge production facility in Fort Worth, and they're not just doing stuff with contacts. They do a lot of stuff with microbes and bacteria because they're focused on how do you keep contacts and things that go in the eye, surgical tools and surgical probes that are used for doing ocular surgery. How do you keep them sterile and clean? And so I actually had a job offer from Bausch and Lomb when I graduated from UTMB before I went to the CDC to work at their plant up there. So there are a lot of those kind of companies that are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, a lot of lab companies in that area that are supporting some of these larger businesses. And so it's worth looking to see, hey, you know, would there maybe be something here I'd like to do? Living in Dallas itself really sucks because it's expensive as hell. And if anyone has been there or from that area, the traffic is a nightmare. But if you live outside of the city a little bit, like I lived in McKinney, about 30 miles outside of downtown Dallas, it wasn't that bad at all. And it's a fairly decent place to be, and there's a lot of opportunities there. Abbott, Sigma Aldrich, a lot of the big lab companies have large facilities in the DFW area. Galveston at UTMB employs about 12,000 people. Most of those people are right there on the island itself. I think when I lived there from 2004 to 2008, I think something like 40% of the people that lived on the island worked at UTMB in some capacity. And again, UTMB is a huge institution. And Galveston, of course, as many of y'all know, is right close to Houston. And there are a ton of biotech companies in Houston. Sigma, New England Biolabs, they make a lot of the enzymes that are used in cutting and processing and handling DNA. Abbott, Invitrogen, Gibco, a lot of these big, large pharmaceutical companies have facilities in the Galveston, Houston area. And so these are other places where, and Galveston is another place that you can look at too. They have a lot of technician jobs that are available there. So if you see something being done in a research lab there that you'd be interested in getting into, there's probably a good opportunity for you to get a position there because they have a lot of job opportunities available at Galveston, particularly at that technician level, at that lower to mid-tier technician level, that bachelor's to master's degree level. So it's very much worth looking at Galveston. You have to contend with the hurricanes, and if you gotta go anywhere, you gotta drive through Houston, which sucks. There's no avoiding it. But Galveston can be a nice place to live. I loved living in Galveston until the ocean swallowed all my shit in 2008. And then once the hurricane destroyed my crap, I was like, I'm done living here. But Galveston's a very fun place to live. There's a lot of opportunities there, not only at UTMB, but because of many of these companies that are also in that area supporting the research that's happening at UTMB. Austin is another place that we've seen. This has been kind of recent in the last 15 or so years. Austin has really started to develop a lot of biotech work, and particularly genetics and genomic sequencing, because Austin has traditionally been very computer heavy. It's very computational heavy due to a lot of the tech businesses that are there. When the Dell School of Medicine got established there about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than 10 years ago, maybe 10, 11 or 12 years ago, they added that biotechy STEM spin to a lot of positions that are there. And because of Dell being there, we've seen there's a lot of big biotech companies that have opened up shop in the Austin area as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a particularly high density of biotech startups in the Austin area, probably because, again, you got a lot of computer nerds there. Startups are very, very popular in the computer industry because two or three folks can come up with an idea, fund it themselves, and make a few $1 million getting that idea brought to market. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. I had a guy that contacted me about wearable biotechs. You've probably seen where people have implanted chips in their hands to use it to open their car doors and that kind of stuff. I had one of these companies contact me that was looking at one of these chips that was degradable. So, because one of the complaints has been, well, I get implanted with this chip and it's stuck in me for the rest of my life. What is going to happen in 10 years after I've had 10 years of a plastic chip stuck inside my body? Is that going to kill me? Is it going to make me sick? And so this company was focused on making these biochips out of inert biological substances that would slowly degrade over time and wouldn't release poison in your body. So there's a lot of these little, and it was a 5-company startup that was looking for somebody to come in and do some of the regulatory work, once these chips were implanted in people, to track them and see how they're feeling, and then do a lot of the paperwork and that kind of stuff associated with filing all this information with the government, kind of a modified clinical trial, if you will. So there's a lot of these opportunities around in the Austin area because of the computational density of tech that's already there. And then San Antonio is probably the last place to mention. They do have some biotech. The Southwest Foundation for Biomedical Research is an organization that does a lot of animal testing. It is the only private BSL-4 lab that's in the state of Texas. So for those of y'all that don't know, for biosafety, for working with dangerous pathogens, there's different levels of containment. Most research labs that you walk into as a student at any UT school are going to be BSL-2 labs. BSL-3 lab, we do have a BSL-3 here on the UTRGV campus. It's in Edinburgh. BSL-3 it's a high containment facility. It's restricted access, and that's where you can work with, that's where I do my work with Zika, dengue, West Nile virus, pathogens that have the ability to cause human disease and to cause fatalities are generally rated as BSL-3. And then a BSL-4 lab is going to be working with things like Ebola, Marburg, weaponized bacteria. These are things that if they were to get out of the lab, have the ability to cause mass casualty events with tens of thousands of deaths. So Galveston has a BSL-4. And the only other BSL-4 that is operating that's a private BSL-4 is the one that operates at the Southwest Foundation in San Antonio. They have the largest chimp colony in the United States. So they've got non-human primates that are there. So they do a lot of work with virulent bacteria and viruses. So the Southwest Foundation has a lot of job opportunities there, particularly if you're somebody that has that kind of experience. UTSA and UTESCA is UT Health Science Center San Antonio, the medical school. They've now, in the last year, finally connected UTESCA and UTSA, so they're one entity. There's a lot of research happening at UTSA and UTESCA as well. Most of the people that are in the Department of Human Genetics here, UTRGV, came from UTESCA. Our group was at UTESCA at the time. So when we transferred down here, many of the people came down with the group. So there's a lot of research happening there. And again, because San Antonio has a very heavy focus on medicine, the Army's primary field surgical hospital training center is in San Antonio. And one of the Army's top care facilities for burn and puncture wounds is in San Antonio. There are a lot of biotech companies in San Antonio that are there to support these industries. So San Antonio is another place that's really good to look at. If I had to look at the list of things that are up here for the 4, and I'm sure I'm not telling y'all stuff that you don't already know, but in my experience, San Antonio was the most affordable place to live. It was the best place to get around in terms of driving. All these other places really suck to drive in. San Antonio is not as nice as it used to be in terms of driving, but at the time when I was there in the early 90s, mid 90s, it was probably the most affordable place to live. And there's a lot of opportunity in San Antonio. So this is just kind of an idea for some places around Texas where you could look to see some of these positions. You would also see some stuff maybe at Texas Tech, some of the other smaller, I say smaller, some of the other non-UT system schools. A&M has some offerings out at College Station, but by and large, these are going to be the areas in Texas where you're going to see the bulk of jobs centralized that focus on STEM or have some location for STEM. So the last thing I just kind of want to figure out and go through, I think this will be the last slide, is just kind of like, how do you get this started? And this is kind of what I did. This is just some advice. Take it for what it's worth. If it's the non-solicited kind, which is oftentimes not the best kind, you didn't ask for it, but you get it anyway. So, but this is kind of what I did. And this is how I didn't come upon this by myself. The guy that I did my master's degree with in San Antonio, I asked him one day, we were sitting there in the lab, and I don't know, it was fucking Saturday night or some shit, because I had to work there all the time. And we had been doing some radioactive experiment or something that we had to do late at night when no one was there. It was like 2 a.m. or some shit. We were going home and we were sitting in his office, and I asked him, his name was Hans. His name is Hans. And I said, man, how'd you figure out that you wanted to do this? Why do you do this job? And he said, look, I picked this career because I figured that this was something that I could tolerate to do for the next 20 or 30 years, that I wouldn't be bored to death from doing. That there'd be enough intellectual stimulation and enough newness in the position that I wouldn't get bored with doing it. It would be something I could stand to do for 25 or 30 years. And that's something that's always kind of stuck with me. So the advice that I like to give to students in my lab that are asking about career stuff is, that's where I like to start with. Figure out what you like / can tolerate to do for the next 25 to 30 years. And I know everyone likes to say, you got to pick a job that you love. You got to pick a job that you love. And in a perfect world, we would probably all have that opportunity. The reality is that that's not how shit works 99% of the time. You're going to get a job because it meets your income requirements, it meets your scheduling requirements, and it lets you maybe live the lifestyle that you envision living for yourself and for your family. So that means that you may have to make some compromises, right? Maybe your dream job is sitting at home, drinking beer, floating around in the pool. That sounds like a nice dream job. You're probably not going to make a lot of money from doing that. So you kind of have to kind of weigh out the benefits of what you want to do. But I think a great place to start is figuring out, what is it that you like to do, or what is it that you think you can do for an extended period of time and not go crazy from doing. If you think you can be a mailman, but after 5 years, you got to go postal because you get sick of walking around the neighborhood being chased by dogs, don't be a freaking mailman. Find something else to do. And I think this is something that is a great place to start when you look at what you're going to do for a career. When I was a kid, I really wanted to be an archaeologist, and I still have a lot of fascination and interest in ancient history. I read a lot about the Greeks and the Romans and these kinds of things. It's very interesting to me. But when I looked at it as a career, I saw that archaeologists were only making like $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And I was like, do I really want to spend 6 months out of a year digging in the dirt in some jungle for 30 or 40 grand a year? Because I also want to have a family. I want to have children. I want to have a boat. I want to go hunting. I want to have this kind of lifestyle. I don't know if I can get there with this kind of career. And so you may have to kind of weigh out ultimately what it is that you think will make you the most satisfied in your life, and kind of balance your career around what you think you can tolerate doing for an extended period of time to be able to make the kind of money to live the life that you want to live. I think another great question to ask, and I've already mentioned this, is what's it going to cost you to do that? If it's going to cost you $1 million to get a bachelor's degree, don't get the bachelor's degree. I think something that we see a lot nowadays is that we have emphasized to many people that college is the only way to be successful. And I think for some people that is a true statement, but I think there's a large majority of people where that just doesn't make sense. I met a guy a couple of years ago. My air conditioning went out of my house. It was like July or some shit. And he had to wait for the dude to come out, and the technician came out. It was like 9 o'clock at night. He comes out, and I can tell this guy had been sweating his ass off all day long. He was stinky. He was dirty. He had been, July in the valley, air conditionings are dying all over the place. He had been working nonstop. And so he's out there working on the AC unit. And so I was sitting there talking to him and stuff. And he was telling me a little bit about what he does, how much he makes, and that kind of stuff. And he had barely graduated high school. He was sending both of his kids to UTRGV to get college degrees, but he had just decided he really liked doing AC work, and he apprenticed for a couple years and he got some experience, and then he was able to go out and get certified, and he started up his own company. And he told me, look, he goes, I make about $150,000 a year with my little AC company, and I'm making enough to send my kids to college and this and that. And so, and he seemed really happy. So I think that's always worth asking yourself is if you're going to get a career, particularly if it's going to be a career that requires a lot of education and a lot of cost, what is it going to cost to get you to that position? And when you get to that position, how much can you earn? And is it at the end of the day going to make the investment worth it? Those are really, really important questions to ask, particularly as we grapple with student loans and making those payments. And as somebody that's going to probably be paying student loans until the day I fucking die, you really need to ask these questions and make sure that if you're going to jump in, that it's going to be worth it in the end. Another great question to ask is if you have a field that you've chosen, where are those jobs located at? And what is the cost to live there? This was something that I've been constantly amazed with when I have students come to me, particularly students that work for me, and say, man, I want to do this and I'm going to go here. And I ask them, okay, what does it cost to live there? What do you mean? Well, you want to go work at this job at Virginia Tech. How much does it cost to live in Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech's located at? What's the rent? What's the state income tax? What's it cost? I mean, how much are you going to, these are important things to answer. When I had finished my doctoral degrees in Galveston and I was starting to go do the postdoctoral training, these were questions that I asked. I had an offer to go to Harvard. Oh, Harvard, that sounds awesome. And so I looked, what does it cost to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts? A one-bedroom apartment was $2,200. This is like 2004. I was like, holy shit, I can't live there. They're only going to pay me 25 grand a year. Because when you are a postdoc or a resident or a fellow and you're doing postdoctoral training, you are basically very cheap labor, very cheap, highly trained labor. And they ain't going to pay you $80,000, $90,000 a year. You're going to get this much money. And they give you that much because that's how it's been done and they can get away with doing it. You don't like it, don't take the job. There's 50 other people waiting to take the job so they can say, I went to Harvard. So you need to make sure if you're going to go to a certain place that you can afford the cost to live there. If there are jobs that are being offered there, what does it cost to live there? When you pay taxes and you pay everything else and you're left with a paycheck, does it make it worth going there? Sometimes when you choose a field, you may inadvertently bottleneck yourself into only being able to work at certain locations. This is something that I've experienced. I have a lot of experience working in high containment facilities, level 3, level 4 labs, working with weaponized bacteria, weaponized viruses, animals, all this kind of crap. It sounds really cool and it's a lot of fun to do, but the places where I can actually get a job in the United States is about 5. Because I need places with high containment facilities. There aren't a lot of BSL-4 labs around or BSL-3 labs around. The BSL-3 lab that we have here at UTRGV is the only one south of San Antonio. Texas is a big place. There's about 4 million people between San Antonio and Mexico that live in South Texas. One BSL-3 lab, one. So if I'm looking for jobs and I need to work in containment, I'm going to go to Galveston. I'm going to go maybe to USAMRIID in Maryland, where Fort Detrick is located, the Army's facility. Maybe the CDC in Colorado, because the CDC's high containment facilities are located in Colorado. They're not in Atlanta. They're mostly located in Colorado. That's where I was. Or you're going to go to Montana. They have a habit of putting these labs that work with these highly dangerous pathogens in isolated fucking areas where nobody lives. It makes sense from the safety perspective, right? Because if there's an outbreak of Ebola, it's only going to kill the 200 people that live in that little town in Bayfield, Montana. The problem is you're living in a town in Bayfield, Montana with 200 people, and there ain't a lot of stuff to do there. So these are things that you kind of have to look at when you select a field. Where am I going to be able to go? For something like genetics or cancer research, those fields are much more widespread. And so there's a much higher probability that you'll be able to find a job in a location that might be much more suitable to how you want to live. Maybe you like going out to restaurants and going to see theater and going to museums and being able to have things to do. that fit your lifestyle. And if you move to an area where those things aren't present, you're going to be miserable, and then it's just going to spiral out of control. So you always have to keep in mind when you're picking a career field, where are the jobs going to be in this career field, and what does it cost for me to live there? Can I actually do this? And I think the last thing to consider is the thing that we don't really often think about, but it's something that you should, which is, what is my backup plan? In the event that everything falls apart, what am I going to do as a backup plan? And I think this is one argument that you can make for getting a college degree, is if you get that college degree, particularly if you get a degree that's above a bachelor's degree, one of the options that you're always going to have, but even with a bachelor's degree, one of the options that you'll always have is the option to be able to teach. You'll always have the ability to be able to go and get a job and instruct somewhere if you've got a bachelor's degree. Now, maybe teaching is not your thing, but if you're talking about, I need to put food on my table so my kids don't starve, and so I'm not living in a cardboard box over there off Longoria with the hobo under the bridge, I need to have a backup plan. If I spend all this money getting this degree and I get a job in industry and 3 years later I get fired or the company shuts down, what's my backup plan? How can I still make sure that I'm earning money? And I think, again, that's the one argument that I think speaks very strongly for getting a formal education, is that you always have the ability, once you get that education, to share that knowledge with other people. And so having a backup plan, saying, okay, well, if I work here, but it doesn't work out, I have enough skills where I could get a job as a technician over here, or I could maybe apply to get a job up here doing clinical trial research. Or if none of those things work out, I could apply to get a job up here and maybe work as a teacher, that kind of stuff. So it's always worth kind of thinking about these things again, because you're spending so much money to get this education. We all have a plan for how we want things to go, but 95% of the time the plan falls apart. And the question then becomes, what are you going to do? There's a very common phrase in the military, we say this in the Marines all the time, is that no battle plan survives first contact. We would plan out battles and missions down to the last detail. And 5 minutes into the fight, something happens unexpected and the whole freaking plan gets thrown in the trash because it now doesn't apply anymore. So it's always worth considering these things. What am I going to do as a backup in case I get my degree, but I don't like what I'm doing, or I don't like being here, or this didn't work out. I like the company, but the company didn't like me, or the business failed. What is my backup plan going to be? Once you take that student loan money, the government's like the mafia. I mean, once you get past that 6 months after you've graduated, where's my money? Where's my money? Where's my money? And we're seeing this right now with people that didn't pay because we hadn't had to pay student loans the last 4 or 5 years. Now people are having to pay student loans and they're like, I don't have the money. And the government's like, don't worry, I'll just take it out of your paycheck. Wow, that sucks. There ain't a damn thing you can do about it because it's the federal government. So it's always worth considering these things and saying, what's my plan going to be in the event that things go south? You don't plan on things going south, but it's always worth anticipating that in case that they do. So this kind of wraps up the mini course. This wraps up the lecture for the day and the mini course in general. I would like to spend some time here and just kind of open things up to some general discussion, and just let everyone have a chance to say what's on your mind or stuff. If you've got any questions about what we've talked about, not only just for today, but for the previous sessions, I'd love to hear them. Y'all have any questions or anything?
I do, but I don't know how to word it yet.
Okay. You can just say it. If you want to.
So I didn't do my undergrad, and I've been in a research lab, but the research lab, it's kind of like we got the results we wanted, so it's kind of like now I don't want to be there anymore, but I want to go into the genetics lab. I know each lab has different requirements or different things. It's how does one go about approaching a professor that you've never had?
Okay, so the question, just so y'all online can hear, I'm going to repeat it, is basically, Karina's working in a lab right now. She's been doing a project. The project's kind of completed, and she's kind of feeling that she might want to try something different. And so her question is, how do you approach, what's a good way to approach a new lab to express interest and kind of see if you can get your foot in the door? And you probably know the best thing to do would just be to reach out to that faculty member. I'd start with maybe an email and say, hey, what I would do first is, once you've identified that lab, spend a few minutes looking at the lab itself and maybe looking at some of the papers that have been done in the lab. something that people rarely do, but you can always tell that they've spent a little bit of time doing so is I'd interview students for medical school. And 80% of those students had no idea about the valley. Didn't know anything about the valley. They'd never been here, which is fine, but they had no idea about the valley at all. They hadn't even taken 30 seconds to Google Rio Grande Valley. They had no knowledge about the valley, no knowledge about the medical school, nothing at all. If you have that kind of person that you're talking to about admissions, and then you have a second person who did spend the 5 minutes to Google and figure out, well, what's the RGV like? Oh, I didn't know that this is a migratory route for birds. I didn't know this. I didn't know that there's 1,400, taco places in every corner. I mean, I didn't know that there's South Pine. I mean, little things like that. And then actually doing a little bit of research into the lab itself, that goes a long way, because then that tells the person that's running the lab, and they're not expecting you to have read and memorized all the research papers, but it at least tells them that you cared enough to spend 30 seconds to Google their name and see what kind of research they're doing. And then this also gives you an idea, because then you can look at the papers and say, because it says on a research paper, not only who the authors are, but what their affiliation is, where they're from. And so when I was doing this, what I would do is I would look at a lab and I would look at their papers from the last few years and see how many papers have students as authors. Because when you're coming into a lab, particularly as a student, one thing that you should aspire to get are publications. The easiest way in science to prove that you know how to do shit is to have a paper that you can point to. I can write anything on a resume that says I know how to do stuff, and people may or may not take my word. But if I have a publication that has my name on it that I can point to and say, hey, I know how to do cloning because here's a paper that I published that shows that I know how to do it. That as a student is what you should really be focused on, is getting that kind of stuff, because that's a tangible proof. It's a tangible piece of proof that you know how to do something. So I would consider looking at the lab, and then looking at the people in the lab, particularly the PI, the boss of the lab, and see what kind of work they're doing. Because that way, when you're going to talk to them, you can drop that, right? You can name drop that and say, yeah, I really was interested in the paper that I read that you published a couple of years ago about how you cloned DNA. And I thought it was really interesting and that kind of stuff. And I'm interested to learn that kind of stuff. You're already, with that kind of statement, going to stand above 95% of people coming in, because it's extremely rare. I can't remember how many times I've had people do that, but it has not been very often, where you have somebody come in and say, hey, I've read your research and I am interested in doing what you're doing. That right there tells you at least they cared enough to spend an extra 30 seconds to Google. And in today's era, that hardly ever happens. So that'd be, I think, a good way to start. Show some interest in the lab, reach out to the faculty member and see if you can schedule, a 4 or 5 minute, and just tell them I'd like to come by for 5 or 10 minutes at some point. Particularly now during the summer would be a great time to do that. All the faculty up here at UTRGV and most faculty in the UT system are on a 9-month appointment, which means they work 9 months out of the year and then they're off the 3 months of the summer. You get paid those 3 months, but you're only working for the 9 months. The medical school is different. We're up here, we're on a 12-month appointment, so we are up here working all the time. But for a lot of research faculty that are also teaching up here, the summer is their time to really research, because they don't have to bottom classes. And so they're going to be in the lab a lot more, and they're going to have a lot more time to bullshit, because they're not, oh God, I got to run a class and I got to grade 42 exams before 3 o'clock. So this would be a great time to reach out and kind of ask some people.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else with any questions online from the peanut gallery? Christina?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm currently working as a lecturer, but I have aspirations to get into a PhD program probably in like 2 to 3 years. I kind of want to build up like my portfolio a bit more. But I've been having a bit of difficulty getting into a research lab, because I was in one when I did my master's. But when I got out, it seems like they're really interested in just taking on like students, like undergraduate or graduate students. And I wanted to see if you had any advice of how someone who's like working a job but still wants to get into research to kind of help me get more experience to look more competitive in getting a PhD like in a couple of years.
So one option that you could look at would be like taking the volunteer route. So there are labs that will let you come in, and normally we don't do this because when someone comes in to volunteer, they're generally coming from outside the institution, which means from an insurance perspective, they're not going to be covered under the UT system's liability policies. For example, we used to let high school students come up and volunteer in the summer and do research. We still do it at a very limited capacity, but I bowed out of that years ago because I was worried about the liability of having somebody come in who's not a UT system employee working in a lab with viruses and getting injured in some capacity. So generally volunteers outside of the institution are a little bit harder to get than volunteers from within. So I think one benefit that you might have since you're already in the system, so to speak, would be you could certainly look at taking on and applying for a volunteer role. And you would have some you'd look a little bit better for doing that than someone outside the system because you would be covered under the UT system's liability policies. And so that would make it a bit more palatable or easy for a faculty member, a lab, someone with a lab to be able to take you on. And I think another place would just be kind of like I talked with Karina, would be trying to identify a lab that you might be interested in, and then doing just a tiny bit of background work on that lab. So you can go in and talk to the person that runs that lab and hopefully impress them a little bit and say, hey, I've spent some time looking at what you're doing, and I think it's really interesting, and I'd like to be able to do this, and this is what my plan is moving forward. I'd like to do this and move on and do that and stuff. A lot of times people are hesitant to take graduate students on or people that have already graduated because from the PI's perspective, you're looking at this person as being somebody that you're going to come in and train to perform a task within the lab. It usually takes anywhere from 6 months to a year to get somebody fully trained to the point to where they can operate independently and you can feel reasonably secure that they're not going to kill themselves accidentally or set the building on fire. I usually found that it took people about 8 to 12 months in my lab to get comfortable where they could do stuff on their own and they felt comfortable, and I didn't have to worry about coming in and finding the lab burned down or somebody telling me they poked themselves with a fingerful of, West Nile virus and now I got to go, figure this out. So I think that'd be one way to do would be kind of like I said with Karina, try to identify a place and talk with them. If you're looking for something like you said, you're kind of looking to get in your PhD, to get a PhD, particularly if it's here, something you might have to consider too is, why are you wanting to take this 2 or 3 year delay? Or take this 2 or 3 year time? Because that may be something that might be hindering some of your ability to get into a place. Is if you go to somebody and say, hey, I'd be interested in doing some research in your lab or checking things out, because I think maybe in 2 or 3 years, I might want to start a PhD. There's a lot of wiggle room in there. And so again, if you're going to somebody, however, and you're saying, and I wouldn't encourage you to do this unless you feel this way, but if this is something that you want to do, if you don't have why are you waiting, right? If you don't have a good reason to wait, then maybe that might be something you might want to reconsider as well, because if you go to somebody and you're trying to stimulate their interest in you to have you come in and do some research, they probably want to get you in there. And then if you work out, they want to get you started immediately. And it's always possible too. And we have had this happen within our PhD program here, where we have people that started as technicians and they worked in a lab for a year or so, and they kind of got their feet wet and they built up some, a bit of a reputation by showing up to work on time and getting their stuff done. So they became a bit more of a known quantity. And then they apply for the PhD program, and they're almost always going to be an automatic acceptance, because it's much safer from our perspective to take somebody that we know than somebody that we don't know. And if you can have a chance to build that reputation, that relationship, it's going to clear the path for you to be able to get into a program. And so you might want to kind of reconsider your approach a little bit and see if there's a way you could maybe shorten your 2 or 3 year time frame to maybe a year or so. And then if you know that you're going to try to get in the next year, then you could go to a lab, like say one of the labs here in the Department of Genetics, and say, hey, I'd be interested in coming in and doing a volunteer role or something for a few months. And it's very likely that might spin into a part-time position or something like that, which may further then clear the pathway for you. Or if nothing else, you at least become known to the faculty in the program. So we would know who you are. People would already have an opinion formed of you and that kind of stuff. And then that would just be that much more beneficial to you when you apply for entry because people can say, yeah, I remember Christina. She worked over here for 6 months. She did a really good job. She was really pleasant to be around. That kind of stuff goes a long way. So it might be worth kind of reconsidering your options if you can in terms of shortening your timeline. But even if you can't, just like I said with Karina, I think a great way to start is just picking a couple labs, looking at what the faculty are doing in there, spend a few minutes looking at some of their research. So you're somewhat versed in what they're doing. So you, at least when you go in there, you don't sound like a complete idiot. You only sound like partly an idiot. This is how I looked at it when I was starting this stuff. I thought after I went to join this dude's lab in San Antonio, I went and looked at some of the research he was doing. I didn't understand a damn word of it, but I at least looked at it. So when I talked with him, I told him, said, "Hey, I read this paper you published in 2003 with this dude. I have no idea what it was, but it sounds really interesting." And then, things kind of went from there. So I think expressing some interest and making yourself available to maybe do some volunteering would be an easy way to start. And you might find a part-time position that pops up as well that you may be able to get into. And many research labs don't necessarily operate on a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday schedule. Research kind of happens all the time. And particularly once you begin to become a little bit more independent, you can kind of do your project at your own pace. This is what I did with my students. I never told them, I don't tell students, you got to be here at 9 a.m. and you got to stay till 6 o'clock. I say, this is what the job is. This is what your project is. And these are what the goals are. And this is the timeline for when you need to have shit ready to go. And as long as you're meeting those goals or those timelines, and if you're having problems, we're communicating, so I know what's going on. I'm not going to beat you to death about you weren't here at 8 in the morning. I had that done to me and I hated it because I didn't like getting up at 8 in the morning to be there at the lab. I'd much rather stay till 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So finding a place that fits your schedule too can be very beneficial. And I think it just might be something you might want to consider if you could maybe stretch it to a volunteer experience initially to kind of get your foot in the door.
Oh yeah, no, I'm be happy to. I love volunteering. Like in my current position and on the side, I'm always volunteering. Like at Quinta Mazatlan and when we have events on campus. But yeah, that's a really good idea.
Particularly for research faculty, they're always willing to take in some free labor, some free help. And if you're somebody that comes in and you can demonstrate your ability to follow it, doing research shit is not hard. It comes down to RTFM, which is in the Marine speak is read the freaking manual. Can you read and follow instructions? That's 90% of research. And if you're somebody that can do that and be pleasant about doing it and not fall apart when shit goes south, because probably 80% of research is going to be failure. Many more experiments fail than succeed. But it's from having the experiment fail that you understand what you need to fix the next time. And eventually you get that experiment to the point to where it works perfectly. And then you can do it repeatedly and that kind of stuff. Learning how to troubleshoot and that kind of stuff is a large part of being successful in research. And I think kind of in life in general, because shit never works the way it's intended. So if you can get yourself in that kind of position, I think it'd do very well for you. And there are volunteer opportunities that exist here in this department within the College of Sciences. And there also are part-time positions that are available as well. And you might be able to find a place that would be willing to maybe give you a part-time role at 10 or 15 hours a week that they could align that would fit with your schedule to where you could still have your full-time position. And if you wanted to work in a part-time capacity or volunteer for 3 to 6 months to kind of get your foot in the door and then make the decision from there. Do I want to pursue this? And if I do want to, then does this person I've been working with, are they willing to take me on? And if they don't have the space or the funding, but they see that you're a good person, they'll recommend you to somebody else. We do that here all the time where I've had students come up to me and say, man, this is a really good student. I just don't have the space in my lab to take any more people right now, but I share their information with a couple other faculty in our department and somebody else ends up grabbing them because they're good folks. So I think that'd be a good route to consider.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from anybody else or comments?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm an undergraduate student who's trying to decide whether or not to do. I know I want to do my master's, but I still am undecided whether to do it thesis or non-thesis. Do you like what kind of is the difference and like what kind of more benefits?
So generally, the breakdown is if you think that you're going to use your master's degree in a research setting, either because you want to get a job as a research technician and you want to be able to lean on that master's degree as research experience, or if you intend on going along and getting a PhD or applying to maybe to medical school, particularly if you're going to get a PhD or something, that's when you would want to do the thesis route. The main difference between the two is that the thesis is generally going to require you to do a scientific project that generates data that results in the publication of a paper. If you do the non-thesis route, that's primarily getting a thesis through taking extra coursework, and that's it, nothing else. Both the non-thesis and the thesis require you to take some classes, but the difference is that the thesis route is usually only about 12 to 16 hours of classes, and the other 20 hours out of the 36 total hours for the master's program comes from your thesis research. The non-thesis option is going to be the entire 36 hours of coursework, which will teach you more about a given subject, but you're not going to get any hands-on experience because there's no research component of it for the non-thesis option. So I think the best place to start, Natalie, would be kind of saying, okay, what do I think I want to do with this degree going forward? If you're looking at using your master's degree to maybe just do instruction or teaching, then you would probably want to consider doing a non-thesis route just because it would be faster and easier to do. But if you think that you want to use the master's degree as a springboard or as a launching platform to get into a PhD program, to do research and that kind of stuff, or to maybe work at a biotech company doing research, then you would probably want to go the thesis route, because that then, again, when you finish that thesis, you're going to have something tangible that you can point to and say, hey, this is my thesis, and it'll be filed with the UT system. It'll be on file until the end of time, or at least until the end of our time. And you'll always have that thesis as a tangible piece of proof that you know how to do shit, because you can point to the thesis, and within that thesis will be all of the experiments and the results and the data that you generated. So people can then say, oh, this girl does know how to do this, because here's the proof, here's the thesis. So it would probably come down to you kind of deciding where you think you want your career to go. But if you're wanting to do something that's going to be focused on doing research, using your hands, whether it's clinical trial research, whether it's research in a PhD lab, or it's research for a company, you probably need to get a thesis and do the thesis option.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. We got a few more minutes here, guys. Any questions left?
I have one.
Sure.
Any opportunities to do research in your lab, in epigenetics and focus on cancer or in neurodegenerative disease in your lab?
In my note,
Or in
I have some, my focus is on understanding how the pathology behind viruses. And so a lot of my research focuses on we infect animals with a certain virus, and then we study that animal. We tear that animal down to the tissue level, to the cellular level, to try to understand how the virus is causing infection in the animal and what kind of disease states are being elicited by the virus or the bacteria in the animal. So we can try to understand, because if you can understand the mechanism behind the disease, then you can hopefully try to come up with a way to intervene at some point. So that's what a lot of my research focuses on now. I do have some ancillary involvement in some other projects here and there, but primarily from a research perspective, that's what a lot of my research focuses on, is on being able, and it's a lot of animal work. We do a lot of animal work. So, people coming into my lab have got to be comfortable working and handling animals, and that also means killing animals. And, we don't chop their head, we don't go crazy, and, there's ethical ways to do all this work, but and this is sadly a lot of research in pathology and infectious disease is going to involve being able to do animal work. And so I generally am looking for people that are going to be comfortable working around blood and working around animal tissues, and being able to handle and manipulate animals as well. And that means being able to hold a mouse or something and understand the thing may try to bite you, and what are you going to do as a response to it? You can't, ideally you won't pick it up and throw it against the wall because it bit you, but it's just, some people are very comfortable doing that stuff, and then some people hate doing it. And I've seen And it doesn't seem to be related to whether or not it's a man or a woman, it's a tough guy or not. I had dudes that were in the Army when I was in Galveston that were in our lab. The Army has a program with Galveston where they will send Army officers there to get their PhD, and then they send them to Fort Detrick in Maryland, where the Army has its bioweapons research facilities at to do bioweapons research there. And we had this guy, this really big, strong, buff black dude. He was a really, really funny guy. His name was Mitchell. He could not handle holding on to mice. We had to buy a chainmail glove for this dude that went from his fingertip to his elbows so he could hold the mice and feel comfortable holding the mice, because we need to pick up the mice. We need to inject them with ciprofloxacin. We need to be able to pick them up and assess them. Mice can get very aggressive. They can turn around and bite you and that kind of stuff. You got to hold them a certain way. We have to bleed the mice, which would involve bleeding them through their eyes. So, I mean, you got to be very comfortable with doing that kind of stuff. And some people just don't like doing that kind of stuff. But for the kind of research that I do in my lab, a lot of it focuses on animal work. And then once we get the tissues from the animals, studying those tissues to try to understand what's happening in this animal. We got a few more minutes left, guys. Any other last questions before we wrap up the inaugural run of the mini course? Anyone doing anything exciting for the holiday? I hope so. I don't know if I'd be going to South Padre, but place is going to be a freaking nightmare, I'm assuming, starting this evening.
I do have one more question, but it's for students.
Yeah.
So for undergraduate students, they are always coming up with questions like, I think one of the ones that is asked most is like if there's any preferred volunteering activities that like medical students can do to kind of enhance like the non-clinical like volunteering is kind of a question I've been getting.
So let me try to rephrase the question back to you just to make sure I understand it. So sometimes people are asking, these are people that are trying to get into medical school, and they're asking about what are some non-clinical volunteer work that they could do that might help their application. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing, and I don't know if there's any one activity that works great, but what I commonly see a lot of applicants doing that's non-clinically related. So I see a lot of people volunteering at some kind of a local clinic, which makes sense if you're going to apply to be a physician. So you start to get exposure to working in a clinical setting. So I see a lot of kids, and I'm saying kids, I'm 54. So if you're younger than 53, you're a kid to me. But I see a lot of kids coming in, and they will have experience doing stuff like working in food banks, working at Ronald McDonald House, or maybe a hospice facility. I see some kids coming in and volunteering at high schools as tutors, doing tutoring. One thing that I would say, Christina, is that I don't know if there's necessarily, when I evaluate applications and I'm looking at people's volunteer experience, one of the things that I look at the most is the length of time they spent doing that volunteer experience. Because sometimes I will see applications come in where they haven't done shit until the last 6 months, and they volunteered at 14 different places. And what that tells me is that they really did this volunteer effort solely for the application. And when you're trying to assess somebody's suitability to be a physician, one of the things that you're trying to guess at is how involved would they be in the community? I mean, when you get a terminal degree, whether it's physician, an attorney, you're a researcher or something, at least from my perspective, I mean, there's not very many people in the community that are going to have that level of education. And so there's a certain expectation, I think, that should come along with that in terms of what are you going to be able to give back to the community, and how well are you going to be able to represent the community? And that's something I take very seriously. I take being an employee of the state of Texas very, very seriously. And so one of the things that I like to see when I look at an application is consistent effort over time, because what that tells me is that they're not doing the volunteer effort just to get it on their application, which there's nothing wrong in that sense, but that they're also doing it because they're trying to involve themselves in the community. And particularly when you're a physician or a nurse, you're a healthcare practitioner, being involved in the community and being able to kind of feel the pulse of the community is going to be very, very important, because that's where you're really going to find out how things are going on. I mean, you probably learn as much. I probably have learned as much from sitting in waiting rooms at shitty little clinics and listening to the people in there talking amongst themselves as I do speaking to the people that run that clinic, because it's the patients sitting in the waiting room that are going to be bitching about the wait times, the quality of the care, whether or not they feel like they're being heard. And being able to hear those things in a waiting room area is going to be something you're not going to get from the providers, because they may not either hear that because they're completely divorced from that because they're back in their room seeing patient after patient, or they deliberately divorce themselves from that because they know that the clinic's not being ran very well and they just don't care. They don't want to hear the complaints. I shouldn't say they don't care, but they're not focused on making sure everyone feels good. Their focus is on doing their job, delivering high quality medical care, but then that's it. Get out of my office. I'm done with you. And so I think it's always worth, when I look at educational and volunteering experience, what I like to look at is consistency over time. If I see somebody has worked maybe only 1 or 2 volunteer activities, but they've been at this clinic for 3 years, and they've been working at this food bank 3 times a week for 3 years, and they've done recording for the blind for 3 or 4 years. Maybe they've only done 2 or 3 volunteer activities, but they've done them for 3 or 4 years. That to me is much more meaningful than somebody who does 10 different things for a month apiece, because you're not going to be able to get to do a lot of meaningful work, I think, if you just do something for a month. But if you're doing an activity, particularly a volunteer activity, over the course of a year or two, this is when you're going to get the chance. If you're at that food pantry 10 times a year, as opposed to 2 times 1 year, that 10 times a year is when you're going to get a chance to kind of really see how people are doing and really start to understand how the community functions and operates. And I think for a lot of us, it's easy to get detached from what's happening around us because we're so busy in our daily lives. We have so much other shit going on. We don't have the time to be involved in those things. And so that's something that I really look at, and I value when I look at applications, is how long have they done this volunteer experience? If they've been doing something like, Habitat for Humanity for 3 or 4 years, that to me demonstrates a commitment. They are committed to not only doing that volunteer work, but they're committed to their overall career goal, because they've been doing this volunteer work over and over and over because they know it's going to be a benefit for their application. And so that to me just kind of speaks to consistency of commitment. And I think that that's very important. At least in my experience, consistent effort over time is probably one of the best traits that you can have as a person. You're going to, at least in my experience, I have failed many more times than I have succeeded, but I've succeeded because I kept going, and I kept going over and over. My effort was consistent. And I think that that's something that people like to see other people demonstrating, is consistent effort over time. So
Thank
I
you.
don't know if that's a question or not, but
I was gonna say thank you. That's very helpful to hear, so I can give like feedback to my students that ask these questions.
absolutely. And again, if y'all have any questions after the session wraps up, y'all all have my emails. Unless a shark eats me at South Padre this weekend, I plan on being here for many more years. So please feel free to reach out to me. I will, as I said, after we get back from the holidays, I will, I've already got everyone's certificates generated. I just need to put your name on them, and then I'll sign them, and I'll have Dr. Sarah Bonagero, our department chair, sign them. And then I'll scan these things and email them all back out to y'all. I will keep the originals on hand, so if you happen to lose it at some point, you can always reach back out to me for it. And again, if you have any, and I'll also send the slides out with your certificate when I email them next week. And if y'all have any other questions about the subjects in the mini course, if you need some additional clarification on some slides, or if there's anything else I can do to help you in terms of career guidance or understanding some of the nuances of programs here at UTRGV, particularly within the genetics department, please feel free to reach out to me. It was great having all of y'all here. I'm so glad we got such a great response. And I hope y'all have a great summer. So if there's anything I can do to help you out, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for attending, everybody, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend and great summer. Thank you for everything.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.